The FAA is one of the few remaining regulatory agencies that can actually fuck shit up at will. That's why aviation is still so safe. If you want to see what aviation with poor regulation looks like, check out the accident record from the 70s to the early 90s. So many major disasters.
There is no country in the world with great passenger rail accessibility, pricing, and frequency that has a privatized rail network. All of the—
Whoa, wait a minute. What? That's crazy. What do you mean? How? What? I don't understand. What? That's shocking. You mean to tell me that a natural monopoly, a natural monopoly is better served when it's controlled by the government? What? Stop. That's crazy.
The best countries when it comes to intercity regional rail networks are all nationalized, either owned by the government directly or through a government-run public company. France's SNCF, Germany's DB, Switzerland's SBB, Japan's JR, Austria's ABB, and Spain's Renfe are just a few great examples of the many nationalized rail companies and networks. All of these companies own the track.
Everyone that's saying Japan does not understand. Fuck it. Let's do Japan. With one exception. Let's have Japan's level of regulation. Do we currently have Japan's level of regulation? Do we? Also, it doesn't matter because that was still built with public funds. Remember when someone just lied about Germany's train being private in chat? They didn't lie. It's still on the stock market. It's just government owned. That's what they're... And the lie in that situation is that it wasn't for profit. Like, it doesn't run as a for-profit institution. It still doesn't turn profit.
Tracks, infrastructure, and the rolling stock, aka the trains. And then there is the US. 90% of US railroads lines are privately owned. Amtrak owns less than 700 miles of track and runs mainly on track owned by the big four private railroads: CSX, Norfolk Southern, Union Pacific, and BNSF. These companies routinely block Amtrak trains with freight either by accident or on purpose. But being made late by a freight train is a small problem compared to what these companies do for improving their rail infrastructure. And when I say improving, I mean either doing the bare minimum required for maintenance or actively making their logistics worse by single tracking some of the busiest main lines with the guise of using precision scheduled railroading. It's so obvious that most of these companies are only in it for the short-term profits. So one solution to this is nationalizing the entire rail network. Nationalization isn't something that the US hasn't done before with anything else. The entire US interstate system is nationalized, with the roads being owned by either the federal government or state governments. It's not unusual for the federal government to pass large infrastructure bills supporting these pieces of infrastructure. One said bill was the reason why interstates were built in the first place, the Federal Highway Act of 1956. Nationalization of US railroads isn't a foreign concept either. Throughout the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, the competition from the interstate system along with long-distance trucking became commonplace, causing railroad traffic to decline. In the late 1960s, three large railroads, the Pennsylvania, the New York Central, and the New Haven, merged into one, forming Penn Central. Because of the terrible merger and the freight numbers, Penn Central filed for bankruptcy in 1970, later eventually disappearing in 1976. Many other railroads at the time also simultaneously went bankrupt, like the Reading Railroad, Erie-Lackawanna, Lehigh Valley, Central of New Jersey, and the Lehigh and Hudson. All of these bankruptcies caused a massive void in the US transportation network, but the federal government came to help. And on the sixth day, the Fed said, "Let there be Conrail," and it was good. Conrail emerged as a new quasi-nationalized consolidated rail corporation. Basically, it was nationalization without the total government ownership. Weird, right? Well, to add to Conrail was Amtrak. Amtrak took over all the failed railroads' long-distance passenger lines while Conrail focused on freight. Amtrak was built to fail but miraculously survived and continues to be the US's intercity passenger rail carrier today. Conrail was eventually split and bought out by CSX and Norfolk Southern in the late 90s. Both of these companies were built to hopefully become profitable without the government's help, which in a very neoliberal mindset makes sense. But when it comes to transportation, this is not always true, nor is it a good thing. There are benefits to good transportation beyond making a profit, especially when it comes to the efficiency of travel and energy that trains provide. Amtrak and Conrail were never truly nationalized because they were never supposed to be controlled by the government, unlike European railways that I mentioned in the beginning. If Conrail and Amtrak were nationalized in the first place, many of the lines that were dropped for financial reasons in the early days would have never happened, and there would still be many places with a station or line that don't have one now. And without nationalization, it's dumb to think that a private company would ever run a train to smaller groups of population ever again. Also, private corporations running infrastructure that both the public and the government rely on is such a heinous mistake. Alright, we're gonna talk about tax policy now. Hang in there. Okay, now stay with me. I know that tax policy can be quite the killer to listen to, so I'll keep it brief. I'm not going to go through all the history of taxation in great detail except for modern day. But know that there was a time when the government practically gave land and tax
Corpus, skip. Skip this part.
havens away to railroads. Eventually, citizens complained. Next, there was a period of time when railroads had high tax rates on them. And then Conrail showed up because all of those businesses failed. And then finally in the 90s, many of the taxes were drawn back to lower percentages. And that brings us to where we currently are in railroad tax policy. So now we must go over how taxes on railroads work. Here is an older tax document from the state of New York. Unfortunately, I couldn't find anything newer than this on the internet, mainly because I myself am not a taxable railroad, or at least not yet. So you can see here how each of these states used to tax rail and still do. What it comes down to is how much improvement is done to a line. Well, except for New Jersey, who taxes it per mile. Yeah, I know, we have a weird state. So generally, if a line is 2 tracks, it will get taxed more. Hence why a lot of modern railroads have single-track main lines in the United States. But this is only one side of the problem. The main part of the problem is how inefficient taxation and grants are with railroads. Generally, railroads will pay some sort of tax on their land. This tax will go to both federal and state governments. Money is then eventually redistributed into the railroads through grants and subsidies. These subsidies usually going to Amtrak for passenger operations and grants going back to private operators for infrastructure upgrades and maintenance. This causes the problem of needing extra personnel in between each of these transactions for bookkeeping, causing a loss of money and unnecessary costs. Now, I'm sure you'll probably think, well, let's just stop taxing these companies so that they can use the cash in the first place to directly upgrade their infrastructure. Well, unfortunately, most private railroads in the US aren't in the business of railroading. As I said earlier, they're in the business of making short-term money. So the majority of the money saved in a for-profit company is directly funneled back into shareholders and upper management's hands instead of back into upgrading infrastructure and for better service. So what's the solution to this? Well, you can either strengthen the unions to have some power to own the railroad to prevent shareholders from poaching cash, or the other option is what majority of the countries around the world have chosen, and that is to divert to nationalization. Most of these problems could be fixed through nationalization and widespread investment into railroad infrastructure. I propose bringing Conrail back. Conrail would take over freight again and would maintain all mainline railroad infrastructure in the country, along with improvements to lines like electrification. Private companies could still own and operate their freight on the network too. They would lease out lines and run their services. This is very similar to how European railways do their services, similar to Flixi-Train in Germany. Class 2 and 3 railroads could also still exist privately too. because Conrail would only operate mainline services, so Class 2 and 3 railroads would still need to exist for freight hubs. Nationalization would use Conrail to turn the current US rail network into basically a copy of the interstate system, where the government owns the rails and infrastructure, but any company can use them if they pay the toll. The main benefit with these improvements through nationalization would be with Amtrak and passenger rail in the United States. Amtrak could truly have control over all the lines and could manage and set up new lines with ease. Amtrak and Conrail could work together to improve infrastructure and build.
Calling it Conrail would be a mistake. I can easily see it be vilified. Why? Conservative rail.
New high-speed rail corridors as well. Commuter railroads like NJ Transit would also benefit. With nationalization, integration of services into a larger network would be a hell of a lot easier. NJ Transit could open new lines that were once owned by private companies easier too, like the CS.
The one thing, Alan is biased towards New Jersey in an unfortunately positive way. The only thing I'll say about NJ Transit is that its colorway is fucking fire. Actually.
SX main line that runs from Manville to Ewing Township. The US truly has a long way to go before even coming close to any of those countries that I stated in the beginning. But I truly think that nationalization is the first huge push in the right direction to get that train moving.
I can't wait.